Today it's going to be pretty much focusing on what we call the deep releases or specific releases. On some level, if there's a neck issue, there is going to be a translation to the low back, and even more so the other way. The low back translating up for the rest of the body is going to cause some kind of an issue. Yes, we have lots of dysfunction. If I saw a client lying like that, I would probably try to, create some bolstering, give them a pillow, make them more comfy, all that. So the lower down the kinetic chain we are, i.e. meaning hip, pelvis, low back, the more of an effect we'll end up having up the chain. The higher the chain, the less likely it is to cause issues down. So there is more of an occurrence of neck issues being more isolated and not causing like body-wide phenomenon. But if you have something lower, like if you haven't had a bad foot ankle time, you don't know because it cascades all the way up. And low back, this is such a complex bridge. And we can't really think about low back. You got the lumbar spine, but then the interface of how that has to be balanced and, it really doesn't want to move a ton. Ideally, this is pretty stable and your body relies more on your hips and your pelvis to accomplish movements. So that being said, you have this weird SI joint, the sacroiliac joint, where, gosh, standing vertically, that's a lot of pressure down into this like little nook. All this body weight is coming down and sitting right there. So if this is offset, and even slightly, it causes a whole, uncomfortable set of symptoms. So is it something here? Is it that the lumbar spine, there's a disc issue, and then that's causing some kind of asymmetry that then is naturally going to cause asymmetry here and down? Because that's the big issue with low back in general. Once something is bad enough, it's going to translate down and up. So after a while, it's always going to be a little bit of a lot. And one thing I'm definitely going to try to reinforce is always assume there's something at the hip joint. Even if working with the pelvis is too difficult or you're just not comfortable with it yet, there's going to be a pretty common correlation with hip joint function and low back symptoms. And it's a case where people won't feel it here, but their ability to move and stress this area of the body less, you have far more adaptability here. So if you can help a person function with the hip better, now every time they're walking around, standing, all that stuff, they're ideally putting less strain on the poor lumbar region. Now, same thing with the neck. If the shoulder girdle orientation is off, then that's naturally going to shift things. And the neck is far more common to have like a real issue on one side versus the other. Common for it to be dominant arm side, all of that. And that tends to be one of the first assessments, at least verbally, that I ask people. Is the pain on both sides or more on one side or the other? Because just that by itself usually gives me a pretty clear pathway of where to focus my attention. So if it's neck, is it tension headaches in kind of both sides, or does it jump sides? You can't, if they say to me, oh, I can't remember if it's more the right or the left. I'm like, okay, cool. That tells me that there's something more uniform occurring here. Low back, very much the same thing, regardless of where the symptom is. If it's more uniform, that's going to tell me it's probably some stuff. And if it's more one side versus the other, it has a better likelihood. So I can just like cut in half my options and try to clean up that mess. Now, when it's more one side versus the other, this is where, all the verbal word salad with the anatomy and planes of movement and stuff, I know it kind of turns into soup. But Structures that move you in the sagittal plane, your extensors and flexors, those tend to be the ones that if it's if it's uniform, same on both sides, that's a bit more of a thing. And it tends to correlate probably more with some postural shift, but it's this kind of postural shift of like being constantly lean forward with like the neck protracted, like distance driver, you know, not that distance driver, but more this distance driver, computer work, everything like that, where your head's kind of and your shoulders are set in a non-ideal orientation, but it's kind of the same. So your tech neck, computer, road rage driver person, that kind of neck, versus it being, you know, clearly one side. And talking about shoulder stuff, the nerve impingement kind of stuff. So brachial plexus impingement is the most common one. And now that can get pinched in a few places, either in the lower cervical spine, but then it has to come down and those nerve branches have to come down under the clavicle and escape through these tunnel of muscles and connective tissue to innervate down the arm. Now, even if it is an impingement here, it's going to cause an effect here. But that's a case, and rotator cuff, all that, that's more like it's definitely more usually on one side than the other. Low back, SI joint related symptoms tend to be one side predominantly. And the really frustrating part with SI joint dysfunction is the side that usually bugs you, and I am not a fan, but I am a victim, is the more mobile side. It's usually a hypermobile SI joint. And so the long story with any of this tends to be when we try to get this more uniform, the long-term solution is some kind of movement related therapy so the person can strengthen their more symmetrical self. They have to try to build some kind of tone in areas that are too long and weak if they really want this to stabilize and or truly progress and get better. Now, if they can't, won't, don't want to, whatever, do that, then it's probably a pretty consistent therapeutic intervention that we use, and it's going to be something where it's like we do it once a week. Over the course of that week, they hold pretty strong. It gets a little bit worse again, then they come and see you and you do the fix-it stuff and you keep on trying to, but you're always just challenging that asymmetry. And we're all prone to it to some level. So, you know, we're sometimes built with a lucky couple of hip joints that are just super durable, and that'll never be a thing. And the problems tend to be more knee and low back, and there's never an issue there. So, and people can just surprise you. They're the way they adapt and the way any teacher or textbook tries to lay out the formula of what you follow. You have to be open to a person being like unique and out of the box. So be willing to be proven wrong. That you're like, oh, this fits this trigger point thing. It's gotta be subscapularis. I know it. And then you get in there and it just hurts and it doesn't produce the results. And then, you know, you gotta also know to pivot and think about other stuff. So the connections. Doing a quick summary-ish. So I mentioned, you know, paired groupings. Ultimately, you have to think about the movement and function of the musculoskeletal system. At least this is how I do it. It's either about posture or it's about gait. You know, if I'm laying down and relaxing, I can just be a worm and hopefully everything's fine. But standing up is a more uniform exercise. Like I stand up, I use both legs, using both knees together, both hips together. The structures of the spine of the neck, everything is kind of having to leverage and get me at least to the starting position. Then once I'm there, I have to start doing this whole cross-body action. And it's the shift between those two where I think things, things get pretty messy. That when movement is disturbed, the muscles related to posture and stability kind of come in and just guard and hold you there. As an analogy, it's like they're creating a brace or a cast to limit the mobility, either to keep you from pinching something that shouldn't be pinched anymore, or just to hold it still so that a lesion or something can heal effectively. And then afterward, those guarding reflexes should calm down and allow the movement reflexes to continue again. But if a person is basically stuck in a compensation guarding pattern for too long, it just becomes the new normal. And the longer it's there, the harder it is to change. And that's another question for any client. How long has this been a thing? Has it basically been a forever thing for you? That's going to be a different story than if it's something that just is new, related to some weird activity they were doing. You know, like I was doing drywall and my back and shoulders are really angry. And I'm like, well, you're going to do that a lot? It's circumstantial, right? Versus something that's been there a long time. And there's an injury history. With the most concerning things, it's usually going to be, you know, with our work, making sure you're not, if there's a disc, a spinal nerve and or vertebral disc issue, we don't want to make that issue worse. So that's part one, right? Don't make it worse as you try to come in and work on this stuff. And remember that although a person may have symptoms, the way the body has oriented itself is an attempt at a solution. That was a philosophy that took me a little while to digest, that what we find, even if it's not the brain's ideal, it is the body's attempt at keeping itself as protected and functioning as good as it can. So you do want to start with trying to do just a little, too little versus too much, because especially in deeper, more sensitive structures, if we change that too quickly, the body can, even if we didn't actually harm anything, sometimes the body just perceives it as destabilizing this protective framework it built for itself. And then the response can be that, you know, in one of the weirder situations, everything feels great for that day, then they wake up the following day and they're real sore and things are ornery. Or it feels great during the session, and then they get up to move and stand, and then things start to spasm up and get angry. Now, that hasn't happened too often for me because I heard so much of a blasting of, you know, don't overdo ideally, but that is an important thing to consider. Whether it be specific deep releases or like the trigger point stuff. Let me grab that chart. This can, you have pictures in the book and you can find them all over online. These two are great assessment things to have for your clients, even if you just bring them up on a phone or something. Does any of this look familiar? Does some of that look like your headache? Yeah. That also could maybe guide you a bit if it's a referred pain pattern. But with trigger points, when I learned that stuff, one of the things that was indicated was in a session not to change more than like 2, maybe 4 of them. Going after all the trigger points you can find in the body and changing all that is usually going to be a case where the person comes out feeling sore. Because you are just shifting it too hard and fast. And the point-based phenomenon thing, the tender point world here is, and it's slightly off topic, but I'm going there anyway. There's lots of charts that will guide you related to points, common tender points. That in this case with the meridians, what you're seeing is usually a correlation along a line. and along that line, a series of specific points. But this wasn't being charted from nowhere. If you take an overlap of the meridian system and correlate it with the neurovascular system, it is cool to see how much the lines themselves overlap. You correlate the points of acupuncture and acupressure to the trigger points, there's usually a 70 to 80% overlap. And then if we just, make it more medical in terminology, usually these points also further correlate with neurovascular innervation sites, where the nerve is innervating with the muscle to send it a signal. I visualize that as like the pilot light, that the activity has to start somewhere and then kind of radiates outward. So that pilot light point, that innervation site, tends to get a lot of signal sent to it. The muscle fibers around that site are going to be more active because they're literally activated more. And you can do movements using muscles and not fire every single fiber. So these tender points can be focused on, and since they have this ripple effect, this pilot light-like effect, that's where the theory and where the results tend to be. If you focus on those spots, how it can have an effect on the whole muscle or have an effect down a chain. So the only thing that distinguishes a lot of these is the maps that you're looking at and following. That you can follow these correlations, and there's a brachial plexus right there. I see it. The thing that distinguishes a trigger point has the referred pain pattern. If it doesn't have a referred pain pattern when you push on it, it's not a trigger point. It's just a tender point. And what's a tender point versus a not versus, that's a philosophical question. Now, many of these deep releases correlate with some kind of referred pain pattern phenomenon. So that can be like a moment where I feel confident. A person says their neck orientation is this, maybe they're off a little bit, or like I get tension headaches and kind of migraine headaches that wrap up around my temple and like in the front of my eye, and I show them the trigger point chart where it shows sternocleidomastoids, trigger point, referred pain pattern, and we're like, oh, this all makes sense. And then when I'm on sternocleidomastoid, I say to them, let me know if we recreate anything that feels familiar, like that headache symptom. And when I really know I found it, is sure, I find sternocleido and I recreate that sensation. We're like, that is it. And I chart it and we see how long it lasts. The ideal story is we don't have to put a person through this all the time. The ideal story is we shift things enough, then they go out and start moving more symmetrically. They change everything about their life and circumstances, and they cement in a better normal, and they can come in and just get a more general relaxation focused massage and not have as much of this. But then I had clients too where it basically had to be every time. And that's how it was. And that can shift how you order your massage. When it was more pelvic girdle, there's two options with this and how you just put it into practice with the general routine. I can just ask the client, hey, we found that worked really good for you last time. Now, it's not very relaxing to do the psoas release and make sure the pelvis is nice and symmetrical. Would you prefer that we do that at the start of the session or the end? And I had more people opt, and I thought that it fit better in my time management to do some of the stuff to start so that I could get that wrapped up. It tended to be something that even they were perceiving as more essential. Like the time commitment, the money commitment they're making is like, this seems to actually really help me. I'd rather get this taken care of and the rest of it is secondary. The problem with that is arguably the philosophy on all of this is you should do as much of the rest of the body first and then go after the specific point. Because ideally you change the tone of everything, and by the time you get to the specific thing, it's not going to be nearly as difficult to interface with, and it might have already fixed itself. So I'm aware of the dissonance of that conversation. So the philosophy is, best practice would be, do everything else first, then zero in on the symptomatic spot and start trying to shift that. But I am also just saying that from a time management standpoint, I had to have that dialogue with clients. And the customer service side of things, guess what? They got to tell me which one they preferred. And I also could flip that philosophy and say, if I adjust the pelvic girdle and get that kind of more uniform, then when I actually have them on their stomach and I'm working here, these muscles aren't guarding up and so tight and angry. So I'm just mostly trying to be aware that there's lots of perspectives of when and how often to do. So based on your time management, I will say my best suggestion is to do that. Ask the client, get their feedback, and then you could even just try one option versus the other and see which one gets you the best result. Get them in part of this. Say, all right, this time we're going to keep it at the end, or maybe this time we're going to do it to start. Does it feel like it lasted longer for you? Did just the order of doing the therapeutic change stuff at the end or the beginning, did that produce a better result? Wow. Okay. Next, I'm going to just go through bolstering stuff related to all of this. And some of that, if we can position a client out of gravity in such a way so these angry structures are put in a more optimal position. Let's say for a joint, it's a loose pack position, especially for the low back and the SI joint. Having a person lay flat on a table like this creates a better chance that you're going to put the spine into hyperextension, and that's just going to, for a person experiencing low back issues, it can be very common that laying like this is actually very uncomfortable, and that's going to be counterproductive the entire time you have them laying there. So if you're going to have them there, using a pillow and shifting that, so that now, even if there is something more that I have to be more cautious of here. Now I've taken that lumbar spine out of full extension, and I have an even additional piece of squish that as I apply force here, there's that little extra give me room. Same thing in side lying for the head and neck. Always have a pillow under their head. And if you have to, get a second pillow or something where it's actually thick enough to support their head so that their shoulders and their cervical spine are relatively uniform. That's where using the square bolster, all that will be a big part of the demonstration. But make sure you're positioning them and using pillows and bolsters to make your life easier. I mean, at the very least, if they're laying there more comfortable during the whole experience, then they're able to maybe relax a bit more, right? So that all by itself. Don't shirk having a few extra pillows of varying sizes available. And if you have to, I've used towels in sheets to, underneath an elbow, all kinds of stuff to just prop things up. But the first starting part is to even ask them the question. It amazes me to this day that people will just be laying there pretty dang uncomfortable and won't tell you, right? So you have to check in. Like, hey, how's your neck and shoulder feeling as you're laying there like this? Would it be better if we had this up? Or maybe is that all starting to create symptoms in such a way where let's just shift gears and not put you in this position? This person, I'd probably be like, yeah, let's put you on your side. This looks wrong. My dad had to have 2 spinal fusions, right? And it's bad. And just broke his hip, and he can't keep the guy down. So it's amazing. So it's quite the journey for this one. Biomechanical creature. I don't see it as particularly safe. I can lay on his stomach a little bit, but just the posture of that and everything, like, no, why risk it? Laying on the side, lots of pillows and bolsters. You know, he's pretty thin, so the table and all of that, I just build a nest, and that's the starting part. It turns into a lot of building a nest of pillows and bolsters to just get him as comfortable as possible. Once we're there, all the applications go so much more smoothly. But it takes that little bit of extra energy to just be like, all right, a little bit more like this, try kind of curling forward, all that. You shift around and find where it's best, and then I'll find pillows to hold you there, right? So always at the very least, once you go on the sideline, always bolster the neck. When we get to supine, there'll be a case where you don't need it, but I suggest for a few of these to just always have the pillow. It'll initially make your life a lot easier. And for no better reason, what it does in these 2 more delicate areas of the spine, it creates this extra cushion where you don't have to worry quite as much about, if you push, that you're taking the spine to any kind of end range. So